Please remain standing as we pray. Almighty and eternal God, how great is your faithfulness and your love. Thank you for this wonderful land you have blessed us with, a people, great strength, courage, faith. The reliance on you, God, and over the years how we have grown and developed. A land of conflict, yet still a people who is blessed, uniquely so, in a land that you have blessed. We thank you for the great opportunity you give to us to reflect on the history of our land and how that in relation to the rest of the region. We pray, O God, for every word that will be spoken. Anthony, as he shared this evening, God, we pray, O God, that each of us, as we learn, reflect, dig deep within, and see ourselves for who we are, we pray for your blessing over every word that would be spoken, the thoughts that would be shared here this evening. In Jesus' holy and precious name, amen.
Former Prime Minister Tillman Thomas and Mrs. Thomas, Dr. Lawrence Joseph, former Speaker of the House, Bishop Clyde Harvey, Honorable Kenny Anthony, former Prime Minister of St. Lucia, and our guest, members of the Diplomatic Corps, we especially welcome the Cuban Ambassador to Grenada, members of the Grenada Revolution Celebrations Committee, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. And we welcome all of you who are viewing via the World Wide Web. Welcome to the 4th March 13th lecture. We've had 2 lectures before. One was held by the Honorable Roosevelt Skerrit of Dominica, the Prime Minister of Dominica. The second lecture was delivered by Honorable Ralph Gonzalez, the Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And we are quite honored this evening to have with us Dr. Kenny Anthony, who would speak to us on the impact of the Grenada Revolution on the region, the St. Lucia experience. In fact, this is a very important lecture on the eve of the 40th anniversary of the advent of the Grenada Revolution. The Grenada Revolution was very significant, not only for us in Grenada, but indeed for the Caribbean and the wider world. So the topic this evening is quite apt, trying to help us understand the impact of the Grenada Revolution on the Caribbean region. And we know Dr. Anthony is quite a regionalist, and we know that the Grenada Revolution had quite far-reaching implications throughout the Caribbean region. So we're happy to be here to be able to learn more about that period and to understand better our history. Now, that being said, I want to invite Mr. Ruggles Ferguson, who is the chairperson, the interim chair of the Grenada Revolution Memorial Foundation, to present some remarks. Thank you.
Hi, good evening all, and apart from the protocol list, which I will stand by, let me also recognize Honorable Peter David, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Grenada's new CARICOM Ambassador, Ali Gill. I'm not too sure why they are sitting at the back. They seem to be given protocols and problems tonight. And of course, Bishop Clyde Harvey, who is in the audience with us this evening. So welcome all on behalf of GREMFO, the Grenada Revolution Memorial Foundation, and the 40th Anniversary Celebrations Committee. For those of you, and I've seen some faces in the audience who were here since the first March 13th lecture, in 2015. We had also one in 2016. And in 2017, there was a panel discussion led by Senator Jomo Thomas, the Speaker of the House of Assembly in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and involving local attorney Richie Maitland and also well-known citizen John Rouleau. And of course, last year, because of national elections held on March 13th, there was no annual March 13th lecture. But we have resumed this year and hope to continue every year henceforth. And as you see, we have been able to attract very high-powered speakers, two prime ministers and now former Prime Minister Kenny Anthony of St. Lucia. Now, let me just take the opportunity to indicate some of the activities for this year's landmark 40th anniversary celebrations of the Revolution. And there are several activities that some which started since the 1st of March, more low-profile health activities where several of the Cuban-trained doctors have been going out to the communities. You have extra where you will have the normal one-week visits in the different parishes throughout Grenada, Carriacou, and Petit Martinique. We have had the doctors going out in the districts, supplementing the usual appearance of the CMO and others in the various communities. So we hope by the end of March that you have actually 4 times the number of visits that ordinary people throughout the length and breadth of Grenada, the man in the street, would be able to see our doctors. We normally have a health fair, and we still hope to have a national health fair before these activities end in May. Last Saturday, we had champs in concerts, and we had our Grenadian-born, Trinidad-based, internationally acclaimed Valentino at the concert, together with scholar, black wizard, Rootsman Kelly, and Ajamo, gracing the stage in an over 4-hour show last Saturday, which of course had to compete with the return of Mr. Killer and the huge delegation that did Grenada proud in Trinidad this year. And I know Valentino was bigging up Killer and the team on Saturday. So let me ask you for a special Grenadian round of applause for Valentino, who is in the audience with us this evening, and his dear wife. Yes. This morning, Dr. Wendy Grenade, who is the head senior lecturer in political science at the Cable campus and head of the Department of Government, together with Dr. Nicole Phillip, visited TAMCC this morning and led a discussion on the Grenada Revolution. And that, I understand, went very well this morning. And of course, this evening we have this lecture. Tomorrow, March 13th, D-Day, we have the opening, the key event will be the opening of the exhibition, which runs for 3 days at Marisho House, 11 a.m. to 7 p.m. each day. I said Marisho House, but Norton's Hall on Church Street. It opens 11 a.m. tomorrow and runs until 7 p.m. Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And at 5 o'clock each evening, there will be a special activity. Tomorrow evening, there will be the formal opening of the exhibition at 5 p.m. On Thursday, that's March 14th, we have the book launch, and By Our Hands, the title of the book written by Steve Cushon, Dr. Steve Cushon, and Dennis Bartholomew. Dennis Bartholomew, Grenadian who resides in the United Kingdom, and Steve from the United Kingdom. Steve is here this evening. May I ask for a special welcome for Steve, also, who wrote this book by their own hands, the making and the building of the Grenada Revolution, and that would be on Thursday evening. And on Friday, there is a special panel discussion at starting 5 p.m., again on the Grenada Revolution. So every day at Norton's Hall, we have activities, and it will mainly be a digital exhibition. Many people are finding it difficult to part with the remains of memorabilia from the Grenada Revolution, and what we have decided to do is to digitize it. So it will be mainly a digital exhibition over the 3 days, and we have 4 huge screens to facilitate that exhibition. Just to fast forward, the activities will culminate in May 27th to 29th academic conference, and Dr. Wendy Grenade is the chairperson of that committee, and the title of that academic conference, Commemoration, Celebration, and Critique, looking at the Grenada Revolution from all perspectives. And of course, invitations are out for persons wishing to submit papers at that conference, which will be held at the St. George's University over those 3 days. And you'll hear much more from Wendy tonight, maybe in her closing remarks, and in the coming weeks. So we invite all of you, those who supported the revolution, those who were rabidly against the revolution, those who were in between. If you wish to submit papers, then you are well invited to do so. Let's begin the discussion of that historic period in our development. So those are the activities, and contrary to the belief, I heard in a particular program 2 individuals who indicated that these guys must have a lot of money to put on all of these activities. And I smiled when I heard it, and in fact I took it as a badge of honor for the great organizational skills of the collective team to pull off these activities without a cent. And that is as a result, and in fact shows what we can do as a people on our own with little or no resources. So you can look out in the coming days and weeks, and in fact we hope to launch a website for these 40th anniversary activities, and the website should be launched by tomorrow or Wednesday. It is in a fairly advanced stage and will be formally launched, because every single day and every year over the past 40 years, many of us receive calls during this period to do presentations throughout in schools and communities throughout the length and breadth of Grenada. And it is time that we have this period of our history well documented. And we intend to keep the now that we are digitizing the material as far as possible, that certainly will be preserved and made available on the internet, on the website, for all to see, and for our students, youth and students who did not live through that particular period to learn from that period. And it's a lady who called me in St. David's here, from St. David's. I received a call, and she did ask me to say that in St. David's tomorrow, it's a teacher from the St. David's school, and some of the students will be laying wreaths. There are several historic sites in St. David's. As you know, yesterday was the 46th anniversary of the birth of the new Jewel movement, the merging of Jewel, which was St. David's base, joint endeavor for welfare, education, and liberation, together with the MAP, Movement for Assemblies of the People, on March 11, 1973. And that, of course, changed the face of politics in Grenada. So with just the initiative of students laying wreaths, I was reminded, in fact, by the teacher of certain names involved in the early struggles, including, apart from the known names like Unison Whiteman and even Teddy Victor, you have Sambas Thomas from St. David's, who was a foundation member of the New Jewel movement. And on March 23rd at Redgate, and those are just activities that people organize themselves, there would be what is described a drum circle by students and youth of St. David's as part of the commemoration activities for the revolution. And that is exactly the point that we make. Many people call us to say, you need to do this, you need to do that, you need to do the other. We have all busy people on the committee, and we urge you and your organizations to also do activities, partnering with us or alone. You can do activities that would highlight and introduce debate and discussion about this historic period in Grenada. So without further ado, let me assure you that with this 40th anniversary celebrations, which I think is the biggest since the demise of the revolution in 1983, that Grenfell and the celebrations committee, and we work extremely well as a team, and we do not come from the same organizations, different organizations, in fact, organizations that were critical of each other over the years. And now we have come together, uniting for a common cause. So let me assure you that we will continue this work in the days, months, and years ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruggles, for that very thorough overview of what's happening to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the Grenada Revolution. We have on the program a poem by Senator, but I'm not seeing him in the audience. Is Senator here? If not, we move ahead, and I would invite at this time Dr. Malachi Dottin, who would introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Master of Ceremony. Former Prime Minister of Grenada, Carriacou and Petitmatic, Mr. Tillman Thomas and family who are here with us. Minister of Foreign Affairs, Peter David, Honorable Peter David. The Cuban ambassador who are here with us. Bishop Clive and Pastor Simon, who are here with us. It's a pleasure and quite moving to have you here with us. Members of the Grenada Revolution Committee, members of the media, sisters and brothers, friends all. Happy am I to extend warm and fraternal greetings here this evening. For me, it is with a sense of electrifying joy and a feeling of great humility, duty, but most importantly, commitments, that I have the responsibility and the desire of warmly introducing the speaker for the March 4th 13th lecture, The Impact of the Grenada Revolution on the Region. Importantly, the St. Lucia experience to be delivered by a multi-dimensional politician, Dr. the Right Honorable Kenny Davis Anthony. In fact, when I was sent with the bio of the Honorable yesterday, it was 15 pages, but I reduced it to 3, so I hope I would have done you gratitude, my honor. Dr. the Right Honorable Kenny Davis Anthony is a former Prime Minister of St. Lucia and Minister of Finance, Economical Affairs, Planning and Social Security. He served as Prime Minister of St. Lucia between the years May 1979 to December 2001, and again from December the 4th, 2001 to December the 11th, 2006. Interestingly, he served as leader of the opposition from December the 12th, 2006 to November the 28th, 2011, and again as Prime Minister from November 29, 2011 to June 2016. He continued to serve as parliamentary representative for Vieux-Fort South in St. Lucia House of Assembly. At an early age, he distinguished himself by breaking records and obtaining many distinctions, which I will not go through based on time. He proceeded to the University of West Indies, Cape Hill in 1973, and then on to Mona in 1974 to read the BSc Government and History, where he gained excellence by owning first-class honors in 1976. The young Kenny Anthony returned to the university in 1981 to the Cape Hill campus to read the LLB as a direct entrance student, meeting the challenge of doing the LMB in 2 years instead of 3, with a remarkable result, owning once again first-class honors and breaking more records in the process, which I will not go through based on time. He later completed his LLB at the UWI before going to the university in the United Kingdom and owning his doctorate in law in 1988, while at the same time owning the bar qualification. In December 1980, he was appointed a senator and Minister of Education. While still in his 20s, the Constitution of St. Lucia prescribed that senator had to be 30 years old to be appointed to the Senate. Kenny Anthony was only 28 years old, so the Constitution had to be amended to facilitate his appointment. Dr. Anthony returned to active politics as political leader of the St. Lucia Labour Party in 1996, leading his party to a resounding victory for election on May 26, 1997, while the largest ever majority in St. Lucia electoral history, 16 seats to 1. As Prime Minister, he formed the Labour Party government for 15 years. His party won another landslide victory, 14-3, to December 2001 general election, but lost in 2006. However, he returned to the office of Prime Minister following a 11-6 Labour majority in November 2011 poll. Dr. Anthony is a committed regionalist. During his tenure as Prime Minister, he served as lead Prime Minister for Justice and Governance in CARICOM, and after 2011, as lead Prime Minister responsibility for sustainable development, including environment and disaster management and water. As lead Prime Minister for Governance, he spearheaded the move towards the institution of the Caribbean Court of Justice in 2005, a flagship symbol of integration. Dr. Tony's vision for an integrated Caribbean moving towards a great destiny has also embraced fully a gender equality. He has not only changed law to secure this goal, but taken political action. In 1977, he appointed St. Lucia's first female Governor General, and his cabinet have consistently had other first female ministers, including the youngest ever minister at 21 years old, a woman. Dr. Attorney continued to serve his constituency as the representative in Parliament in St. Lucia. He has returned to private practice and managed his own legal affairs. Anthony and Anne Prime. Ladies and gentlemen, sisters and brothers, it is my distinct pleasure to call to the electum Dr. Anthony to conference in today's activity.
Can we raise this a little bit? Can we raise it? That's okay. You might have to bring it forward now. Come here. That's the politician in me, you see? Thank you. Ah, God. That's good. Now tighten it. Yeah. I think that's good now. Good evening, everyone. The Honorable Tillman Thomas, former Prime Minister of Grenada, Carriacou, and Mr. Thomas. The Honorable Peter David, Minister of Foreign Affairs. Honorable Sir Lawrence Joseph, former Speaker of the House of Assembly or Representatives. Bishop Clyde Harvey, Pastor Standard Simon, Her Excellency the Cuban Ambassador to Grenada, and if I may tonight, I want to also recognize Mr. Damian Greaves, who was a former cabinet minister in the government that I had the honor to lead, and who is now a resident of Grenada. Members of the Grenada Revolution Celebration Committee, members of the media, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I thought I should tease Dr. Malachi Doughton a little bit. I noticed he described me as the Right Honorable Kennedy Anthony. I need to tell him I'm still a left honorable. The second thing that I want to do very quickly, however, is to also indicate to him that I don't want to leave the audience with the impression that I'm responsible for the sole amendment to the Constitution of St. Lucia. Now, I'm not going to touch on this tonight, but you may get glimpses of the tumult that occurred in St. Lucia that may have facilitated that. In actual fact, yes, I precipitated the issue, but by the time they amended the Constitution, I was in fact 30. So I just want to tell you that I'm really not the cause of it after all, and I thought I should clear the historical record. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for that aside. We gather tonight to celebrate an anniversary, a truly remarkable event in the political life of the people of Grenada, and indeed the wider Caribbean and the world. It is perhaps a good thing that so many of the actors, so many of the personalities who participated in the events which led to the revolution, who watched the revolution unfold and then consume itself in a singular suicidal act, are alive today to share their stories, opinions, explanations, and yes, their pain and their grief. When I think that the revolution occurred some 40 years ago, and many of those who witnessed and or participated actively in constructing its future are still alive today, I am reminded that the Grenada Revolution was, by and large, a uniquely youthful revolution, having been largely masterminded by a relatively young, idealistic, courageous, and ideologically grounded leadership. As I watch from a distance, I doubt that the ghosts of the revolution have been exorcised in Grenada. The burden of dealing with the inconvenient truths of the revolution is not just that of the Grenadian people, however, but indeed the entire region, its intellectuals and ideologues alike. Anniversaries are celebrated in life and death. For my part, the revolution did not die on that fateful day in 1983. It may have suffered the loss of its own soul, but the rebel did not die. Certainly not in the hearts and minds of those who lived through it and those who struggled to keep it alive. Either way, whether as witnesses or participants, both knew that a unique experiment was underway in Grenada to construct a new society, economy, and polity. It is an unfinished business left now to new generations that will soon replace us. After all, many of us are, in the words of Owen Arthur, the former Prime Minister of Barbados, in the departure lounge awaiting our boarding call to the great beyond. That single event, in a small three-island nation in this small part of the world that is our Caribbean, left an immediate and indelible impression on our hemisphere, and I dare say on the entire world. It maintained curiosity and attention for nearly 4.5 years. As Fidel famously said, it was a big revolution in a small country. The revolution and its demise have attracted a voluminous number of books, articles, and commentary. We have also had the opportunity to read the recent accounts of some of the key personalities of the revolution. Most of the accounts and analyses have understandably focused on the internal dynamics of the revolution. I note that the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute for Social and Economic Studies of the University of the West Indies in Trinidad and Tobago will tomorrow host a half-day symposium to review the Grenada Revolution 4 decades later. The call to papers inviting contributions describes what happened here on March 13, 1979 as the first non-democratic transfer of power in the Anglophone Caribbean by a Marxist-Leninist movement. Whether or not it is accurate to say that the transfer of powers to a Marxist-Leninist movement is in itself a healthy subject for debate. Be that as it may, this is a welcome initiative, and I hope it will provide further insights into the revolution and its contribution to shaping Caribbean political thought, discourse, and practice. All accounts are important, and all versions have a place in Grenada's still continuing story and indeed in the politics of the wider Caribbean. So let all discourse contend. On reflection of much of the literature that is available, I noticed that few of the accounts are focused on the remarkable impact of the revolution on Grenada's neighbors, individually or collectively. Tonight, I have decided to contribute to redressing that imbalance and share a different story, the impact of the revolution on our region generally and on St. Lucia specifically. I want to demonstrate how it influenced and shaped our post-independence politics. It is a small contribution towards completing the circle of history, because we all are, in our own ways, children of the Grenada Revolution. So I am here, like many others before me, to touch the collective memory of the Grenadian people. But let me be clear from the outset. I do not offer any rigorous, structured analysis of the revolution. Rather, I have decided to be reflective and anecdotal, filling in pieces of history, perhaps sharing with you unknown facts and events. I shall focus on the confluence of external forces that created the conditions for revolution in Grenada and the drive for radical change in the Caribbean, and more specifically St. Lucia. I shall argue that the collapse of the Grenada Revolution led in turn to the demise of the Caribbean left and an adoption of alternative routes to political power, which I will suggest awaits the judgment of history. But I must also tell you what I do not propose to do tonight. I will avoid visiting the ugly events of October 1983, the cost of which continued to be paid across the region and the world, but even more so in Grenada, where the bullets flew, bombs exploded, and so much blood was shed. 40 years later, the accounts continue to vary as to just what happened here, and finally Bernard Cord has offered his own account. That too I will avoid commenting on, as the jury is yet to pronounce its judgment. Nevertheless, too many issues continue to be shrouded in mystery. To be sure, there are other aspects of the revolution yet to be explored. For example, there is also the matter of the remarkable ability of the leadership of the Grenada Revolution to have safely steered through the turbulent political waters in the region at the CARICOM and OECS levels. The political dexterity of Maurice and Bernard to navigate those waters was truly remarkable. Their respective roles in the eyes of people beyond Grenada's shores commanded the kind of respect for the revolution that empowered its voluntary political ambassadors across the region to sell the revolution's story with pride and confidence. There is also the fascinating question as to whether the revolution paved the way for its own demise by choosing to operate its constitutional order by retaining the Queen's representative in a hybrid legal system, a mixture of homegrown laws based on the principles of socialist legality, if ever that term could be used, side by side with a large common law legal system with its Caribbean peculiarities. Arguably, the legal arrangements which underpin the revolution, pragmatic as they may have been at the time, may well have helped to suffocate it. Just after preparing a draft of this speech, I noticed that Dr. Hamid Ghani, director of SALIS, will at the SALIS symposium mentioned earlier, addressed the question whether the decision of the People's Revolutionary Government to retain the Crown and the Governor General in 1979 was a tactical blunder. It will be interesting to see what emerges from this discourse. So, all in all, tonight, my ambitions are rather more modest. There can be no doubt that 1979 was a momentous year in the calendar of world history. The stage for the events of 1979 had been set decades earlier. The liberation struggles in southern Africa had gained new momentum thanks to the support of Muammar Gaddafi and, crucially, the sacrifice of Cuban soldiers. And those of us who sit here tonight must never, ever, ever forget that Cuban soldiers paid their lives in blood for the black people of Africa. Never ever forget that. Because no other nation has ever come to the rescue of black people anywhere in the world, but the Cubans did. And we owe them a debt of gratitude. The struggle to dismantle apartheid had become unstoppable. Robert Mugabe was just months away to becoming the Prime Minister of Zimbabwe, after chipping away at the apartheid regime constructed by Ian Smith in that country. The Middle East was in ferment, inspired in large measure by the extraordinary leadership of the PLO leader, Yasser Arafat. There can be no doubt that 1979 must remain etched in our collective memories. Still, few expected that 1979 would bring such dramatic and fundamental political changes to the Caribbean, Latin America, and the Middle East. We cannot detach Grenada from these wider events because they provided inspiration to the revolutionaries of Grenada and much needed space in the early days of the revolution. On February 11, 1979, the Iranian Revolution shook the world. It led to the overthrow of the Shah of Iran and the 1,000-year-old Persian Republic, and in its wake, the establishment of the Islamic Republic under Ayatollah Khomeini. The Iranian Revolution was welcomed across the world, save in the United States for reasons which do not require revisiting tonight. A revolutionary theocracy had succeeded and the world was left perplexed and confused about how to respond to this new reality. The question was simple. How do you respond to a system of government by clerics claiming a divine commission? Although this was nothing new over the course of civilization, yet for many it was unthinkable that it would happen in a so-called age of enlightenment. The specter of more theocracies now haunt the world. Understandably, the reaction in the Caribbean was mixed. Some welcomed the revolution because it was felt it was a fatal blow to American imperialism and expansionism. Others were more cautious and reserved in their assessments, unsure how to react to a revolutionary religious movement taking over an oil-rich republic that was also a major Islamic outpost. Those of a Marxist-Leninist persuasion knew full well that religion and politics was inflammatory and combustible. But only 4 weeks and 2 months later, on March 13th, Grenada joined Iran as a second nation in early 1979, this time a small Caribbean multi-island nation, to present the world with another classic example of revolutionary change. Grenada's revolution sent shockwaves through the State Department. Grenada's proximity, like that of Cuba, unleashed paranoia, fear and concern among policymakers in Washington and to some extent in London. Then while the Americans were preoccupied with the implications of the Iranian Revolution for US policy and hegemony in the Middle East, and of the Grenada Revolution in its own hemisphere, there came the third major political upheaval, again even closer to the US mainland than Grenada, the Nicaragua Revolution led by the Sandinistas. These three revolutions, one each in the Caribbean and Latin America, and the third one in the Middle East, would fundamentally change the course of political events in the respective regions. The Ayatollah and his religious revolutionary leadership in Iran, Daniel Ortega and the Sandinista National Liberation Front, FSLN in Nicaragua, and Morris Bishop and the New Jewel movement in Grenada posed a tripod of problems for Washington. These events would fundamentally change the way the United States of America and other Western nations regarded their respective positions in the face of increasing evidence of revolutionary changes taking place both near and far. But with Cuba just 90 miles away, and now Grenada and Nicaragua also providing examples and encouragement for other national liberation movements in Latin America, the United States' response took on military dimensions alongside greater direct political and economic support for those right-wing and conservative regimes it supported and kept in office in that part of our region. Even more worrisome for U.S. policymakers, the Farabundo Multinational Liberation Movement, FMLN, appeared to be gaining ground in El Salvador. The United States became even more determined to do all within its great military and political power to prevent FMLN victory. Suddenly, the normal, placid democracies of the Eastern Caribbean became subjects of curiosity and intense interest. The unthinkable had happened. Even though there were warning signs of restlessness in Guyana, Jamaica, and Trinidad and Tobago, the United States responded by strengthening its intelligence gathering capabilities, changing its diplomatic personnel, and to quote a friend of mine, including making its diplomatic personnel even more seductive, building local alliances with sympathetic business interests, trade unions, religious groups, and of course intellectual elites ensconced in universities in the various countries. All of a sudden, U.S. operatives became interested in the leadership and membership of fledgling political organizations and movements across the region. It is against that background and within that context, particularly the U.S. response to the Grenada Revolution in the Caribbean and the Nicaragua Revolution on the American continent, that we must tonight examine how your revolution in Grenada impacted our region and St. Lucia. But first, let us continue our review of the historical context, albeit superficially, to better understand why my generation of activists to better understand my generation of activists and the decisions which we made. Years earlier, before March 13th, 1979, the stage for the Grenada Revolution had been set. The region was just emerging from what some have described as its black nationalist phase, influenced unquestionably by the Black Power movement in the United States and in the United Kingdom, and events in Jamaica, Guyana, Trinidad, and Tobago. Political challenges had been issued to the Eric Williams-led People's National Movement regime in Trinidad and Tobago, the Hugh Sherrill-led Jamaica Labour Party, government in Jamaica, and the Falls Burnham-led People's National Congress in Guyana. In Jamaica, following its accession to office, the People's National Party, led by Michael Manley, had embraced democratic socialism as its guiding philosophy. However, gentle as democratic socialism may have been, it unleashed fierce ideological battles in Jamaica, ferocious resistance from its ruling elites, and uncompromising opposition from the United States. Michael Manley had presented to Jamaica and the Caribbean an alternative path to governance and development. And I want you to remember this, to stick a little pin, because you see, in the debate that follows among left-wing organizations in the region, the Jamaican example stood out to provide testimony of an alternative route. So just stick a little pin. Make no mistake, this period helped to excite and radicalize our generation. What until then had been a complacent and dormant political culture suddenly came alive. Our generation was brought face to face with our political inheritance, who we were what we were and what we should be. It unleashed a wave of black consciousness, challenging us to redefine ourselves, our culture, beliefs, and image. We discovered our blackness and what it meant. To crown it, the music of the times echoed our rebellion and resistance, gave us new rhythms and lyrics, and played to our consciousness. It was an exciting time to be alive. Nearly every island was affected. In St. Lucia, the leading activists and advocates George Odlum, Peter Josie, Calix George Sr., and Hilford de Turville grouped themselves under the umbrella of the Forum and proceeded to articulate its own message of black economic enfranchisement and consciousness. Week after week, electrifying speeches were delivered from the city's main square to hundreds who came to hear the message. But this phase, exciting as it was, did not endure. It was short-lived. The political limitations of building a political movement solely on racial and cultural consciousness, crucial as these elements became exposed, it was easy for the detractors to accuse the movement of racial bigotry. Lacking ideological anchors, the movement exhausted itself and collapsed. Its historical mission, one might say, complete. This is not to say it accomplished nothing. That would be a huge mistake. No other period has shaped Caribbean consciousness as the decade of the 70s. More pointedly, some governments were compelled to make adjustments to accommodate the rising tide of frustration, anger, and disappointment. The People's National Movement in Trinidad and Tobago was one such example. Following massive public protests and a near mutiny in the army, Eric Williams moved quickly to review the Constitution of Trinidad and Tobago and to create a state sector in the economy of that country. It is only now, after some 50 years, that the National Joint Action Committee, NJAC, is being given the credit it deserves for shaping post-independence Trinidad and Tobago. At this conjuncture, and I want to reinsert myself a little bit again by saying that it is important that we do not see the Grenada Revolution in isolation. We need to understand what was taking place in the entire Caribbean. The ferment, the new consciousness, the new self-confidence, all of this was helping to set the conditions for the revolution here in Grenada. At this conjuncture, the question was whether the emerging left should create vanguard parties in the Leninist sense, or create and establish new political formations or parties, or infiltrate and join the existing political parties and over time replace their leadership, or adopt the alternative path fashioned by the People's National Party in Jamaica, derisively dismissed by some as a petty bourgeois alternative. This was the big political question of the period. Both the Grenada Revolution and the path of democratic socialism in Jamaica were available to provide testimony. In the case of St. Lucia, the question resolved itself in two directions. The remaining radicals who subscribed to the thinking of the Forum formed the new political party, the St. Lucia Labour Action Movement, aptly described by the acronym SLAM. Unfortunately, within weeks of its formation, irreconcilable ideological and tactical differences arose between the founders, and the new party collapsed. Thereafter, George Odlum, Peter Josie, and Francis Mitchell, the unquestioned leaders of the radical left of that period, exercised a third option and made their way into the ranks of the established opposition St. Lucia Labour Party. A condition of entry was acceptance of the then leadership of the retired High Court Judge, Alan Louisi. Others of a more revolutionary orientation believed that the route to political power required the creation of a movement or league, initially to bring together those who were sympathetic to the left and prepare them for the transformation to a vanguard party. I was among them. Following the example of the formation of the Workers' Liberation League of Jamaica, a group of us in St. Lucia formed what we described as the Workers' Revolutionary Movement, WRM. In those days, I was completing a degree in government and politics at Mona, the University of the West Indies. There I met both Trevor Monroe and Bernard Code. Both lectured me. Like many left-wing aspirants of the day in search of answers and solutions to the problems and challenges of our respective countries, I followed lectures in Marxist political thought organized and delivered by Trevor Monroe at UWI. Bernard and I became close friends. For those of you who may wonder and then drift into speculation, I confess that I knew Bernard far better than I knew Morris. There was no doubt that Bernard had a formidable intellect. It was clinical, structured and incisive, with an amazing capacity for detail. Bernard was convincing and persuasive. He was a brilliant writer and an appealing orator. His was a mind that could easily feed those who were thirsty and hungry for knowledge, inspiration, and direction. Our relationship forged at UWI Mona deepened when both of us returned to our respective countries. Indeed, Bernard came to St. Lucia on more than one occasion when he needed a break from the political struggles in Grenada. On every occasion, we met to share views and ideas about Grenada, the region, and the way to revolutionary change. Inevitably, close ties developed between the ANJM and the Odlum faction of the St. Lucia Labour Party. These ties had already existed during Black Power days, but it now took on decidedly political character. By March 12, 1979, the progressive movement in St. Lucia, and I refer to the Odlum faction in the St. Lucia Labour Party, members of the WRM in particular, along with radical elements in the trade union movement, had long developed fraternal ties with the NJM in Grenada. There were indeed a few occasions when injured NJM comrades, including Morris, sought and received quiet refuge in St. Lucia after being beaten by Gary's thugs. St. Lucia also provided a temporary refuge when the lives of the Grenadian activists appeared to be in grave danger. Lectures and public presentations by the likes of Morris and Bernard were also facilitated by the WRM and other progressive forces under its organizational influence, all in a bid to strengthen the bonds of solidarity and to update St. Lucians on the unfolding situation in Grenada. The St. Lucian authorities became increasingly nervous about these visits, and on one occasion, WRM was denied permission to host a public address by Bernard. Publications by both NJM and ORL were quietly sent to St. Lucia and were circulated to selective persons who in turn ensured circulation to others in the chain. In those days, the circulation of such material was risky and of necessity had to be clandestine. So unbelievable, as if it happened just yesterday. In retrospect, the lack of sophistication in handling and managing fraternal ties began to appear early. First, the relationship between the NJM and the St. Lucia Labour Party was largely sectarian, in the sense that the relationship was essentially between Morris Bishop and George Odlum and his inner circle. It was never a relationship with the St. Lucia Labour Party per se, but a faction within it. It is true that the leadership of the Labour Party tolerated these ties, but the party as a whole was generally nervous and uncomfortable. Meanwhile, WRM, on the other hand, focused on its relationship with Bernard and Oral, an organization, as you know, whose formation was largely inspired by Bernard. Let us now turn very quickly to the political conjuncture in St. Lucia on the eve of the Grenada Revolution. And here I must move very, very quickly for obvious reason of time. By 1979, both George Odlum and Peter Josie were solidly embedded within the ranks of the St. Lucia Labour Party. But though deep in the bowels of the St. Lucia Labour Party, they nonetheless maintained a separate and distinct political identity and personality. It was a curious marriage. On the one hand, Alan Louisi provided a veneer of respectability, calmness, and dignity. He reassured the business community that St. Lucia Labour Party was no threat and that he could contain the excesses and exuberance of Odlum and Josie. On the other hand, Odlum and Josie were the radical firebrands. They mobilized the poor, the disenfranchised working class, and the disaffected within the middle class. Time and time again, they confronted the UWP government in mass protests. The UWP tried hard but unsuccessfully to sell the SLP as a party that would take St. Lucia into the so-called Cuban orbit, while fanning the early flames of division within the SLP itself. On February 22, 1979, St. Lucia became an independent state, but the island was sharply divided. The celebrations were marred by a national strike by public sector unions for higher wages and better working conditions. The strike lasted some 47 days, still the longest on record against any incumbent government in St. Lucia. The St. Lucia Labour Party ran a campaign of no independence without a referendum, and independence yes, Compton no. WRM, and it sounds familiar I'm sure to some of you here, WRM, in a burst of idealism, initially supported this approach, but a twist of history intervened. Bernard Cord, in a conversation with me at Mona, described the position of WRM as backward and infantile, and persuaded me that WRM should change course and argue for independence. It was Bernard's view that the removal of the vestiges of colonialism, even if supported by the British, was a vital step to creating an environment conducive to revolutionary change. I communicated this to the comrades in St. Lucia, and the adjustments were duly made. George Odlum was not particularly happy by this turn of events. Then suddenly, that Tuesday morning, March 13, 1979, the news came over Radio Antilles. And these are words I assume you'll remember forever. And now and then you need to remind yourselves. Maurice Bishop declared to the people of Grenada, Carriacou, and Petite Martinique on that morning, quote, "This revolution is for work, for food, for decent housing and health services, and for a bright future for our children and great-grandchildren," unquote. Between reports from news broadcasters, Alistair Hughes in Grenada and Lew Smith at the popular and powerful Radio Antilles in Montserrat, the rest of the Caribbean and the world got minute by minute and hourly, ball by ball updates as they went on. People across the region and the world actually heard on radio the declarations that changed Grenada forever. The clear voices of Maurice Bishop and Bernard Cord making the announcements that the People's Revolution was born. That of Deputy Prime Minister Herbert Prudhomme in the Gary regime accepting that Gary government had been ousted. The oral proclamation of the first People's Laws on Radio Free Grenada, and the unprecedented peaceful change of government by force of arms. In my view, the success of the revolution was generally embraced by the people of the region. Initially, it attracted considerable sympathy among the ruling elites in the region, many of whom were outraged by the atrocities of the Gary regime. Some governments were more muted in their praise and viewed the unfolding events with alarm and deep suspicion. The question for many of them was simple: who's next? In the St. Lucia context, the bulk of open public support for the Grenada Revolution came from the supporters of the St. Lucia Labour Party and those influenced by the organizations such as the WRM. General elections were held in St. Lucia on July 2, 1979, almost 3.5 months after March 13, 1979. The euphoria ignited by the revolution was at its height, and already the people of the region had started to witness an alternative approach to development and governance. The Odlum faction immediately latched onto the revolution. The events in Grenada had captivated the imagination of the electorate and appeared to validate their own robust challenges to the ruling United Workers' Party led by John Compton, as he then was. The United Workers' Party relentlessly attacked Odlum and told the electorate that Alan Louisi was a mere figurehead and that Odlum's ambition was to transform St. Lucia into another Grenada or another Cuba. John Compton had already made it known that he was fiercely opposed to the revolutionary events in Grenada. Indeed, just hours after the events on March 13, 1979, he dispatched St. Lucia's High Commissioner in London, Dr. Claudius Thomas, to meet with the Foreign Office to persuade the British government to intervene in Grenada. Fortunately, the United Kingdom government disregarded that advice. As the campaign progressed, it was clear that the opposition, St. Lucia Labour Party, was in a commanding position. I doubt, however, that the SLP would have won as convincingly as it did without the support it received from the NJM. I know the extent of support, as I was sent as an emissary to Grenada and elsewhere in the region to seek political and financial support. I met both Morris and Bernard in Grenada, who guided and introduced me to potential donors for the campaign. Both made it clear that a victory by the St. Lucia Labour Party was vital to Grenada, particularly to broaden the pool of sympathy within the OECS and the wider Caribbean. With their help, resources in money, equipment, and electoral propaganda poured into St. Lucia for the campaign, organized in large measure by a humble servant, though in later political life I paid a brutal price at the hands of George Odlum and Peter Josie, as I was accused of stealing funds provided by a regional donor. And just as an aside, and we talk about justice in the region, by the way, when Josie uttered words which I regard as defamatory, I sued him. After 23 years, a judgment, well, only a partial judgment has been given. The case is still in the courts after 23 years. The SLP would win the election with a handsome 12-5 majority, the first time in the political history of St. Lucia that the party had 1 2/3 majority in Parliament. Louisi became Prime Minister on one condition, that he resign after 6 months and yield to George Odlum, who was made Foreign Affairs Minister in the new government. And some of you may wonder, well, where did I get that from, or can I authenticate it? The answer is yes. Because after the general election, when the party met the day after, I was preparing to return to St. Augustine campus to resume a master's degree. Alan Louisi came to my house in the south, and at that meeting he said to me, yesterday was a rough day, last night was rough. I said, but why should it be rough? You've just won elections, you have a government to organize. He says, well, you see, George and Peter made so much noise, I feared the party would split. They insisted that I must resign after 6 months. So under the pressure and to save the government, I agreed that I would be Prime Minister for 6 months and become Governor General after. Those were his words to me. Within 6 months, the first of the so-called power struggles was unleashed. An uneasy calm returned after the intervention of several persons. But that peace was short-lived. Several months later, another round of the power struggle ensued, leading to a vote against a budget presented by Prime Minister Louisi, who, out of honor and convention, resigned. Winston Snack was appointed Prime Minister to replace Alan Louisi, and his tenure was quickly amputated. Odlum reacted to Snack's appointment by mounting a fierce campaign against him. In this, he was joined by the UWP. Together, they orchestrated massive public protests and brought the Snack government to its knees. A caretaker government under the leadership of Michael Pilgrim, whose constitutional validity remains extremely doubtful, was appointed to pave the way for general elections. George Odlum decided to go his own way and form the Progressive Labour Party. Peter Josie, who had voted with Odlum against Louisi's budget, refused to join him and opted to remain with the St. Lucia Labour Party. The collapse of the SLP government dashed the hopes and aspirations of those who had labored so hard to not only support Grenada, but also to try to see how best the experiences and lessons from the revolution could be applied, both in the political arena and in the management of the state, It is true to say that many were fascinated by the new and popular social and economic policies, including the development of grassroots democratic structures that involve greater levels of popular participation. Two questions invite reflection. Firstly, what led to the conflict between George Odlum and Alan Louisi? Secondly, how did the unfolding events in Grenada feature the collapse of the government led by the St. Lucia Labour Party? And I suspect a lot of you don't know how prominently Grenada featured in the collapse of that government. And this is not, of course, to invite you to inflict any blame on yourself. I'm just repeating some historical events to you that may not be known. There can be little doubt that the seeds of the conflict were sown in the less than perfect union between the Odlum faction and the rank and file of the Labour Party membership led by Alan Louisi. When Alan Louisi reneged on the agreement to hand over to Odlum, it became impossible to manage or contain the conflict as the battle was waged openly in the press and on political platforms. The episodes of the struggle between the Odlum faction and the Louisi faction were colorful and full of theater. And you have to remember, still relatively young, so I was highly fascinated by some of it. But this is not the occasion to regale you with what I witnessed or experienced. The second question, and it is this question which I suspect will interest you: why did Louisi become distrustful of the relationship between the NGM leadership and the relationship with the George Odlum faction of the SLP? I can posit three reasons. One, the perceived support extended to the Odlum faction by the NGM leadership. Two, the radicalization of St. Lucia's foreign policy under George Odlum. And three, a small shipment of arms to St. Lucia ostensibly for the personal security of Odlum and the key functionaries in his faction. Bet you didn't know that, huh? Initially, Alan Louisi was exceedingly sympathetic to the revolutionaries in Grenada. Some 4 months after the revolution, and a mere 2 weeks after the general election in St. Lucia, on July 15, 1979 to be exact, the Prime Ministers of Dominica, albeit in an interim capacity, St. Lucia and Grenada met in Grenada and issued a 20-point communiqué establishing inter alia several commissions to advance cooperation on a variety of subjects. Although exceedingly ambitious, the communiqué was described by one commentator as unlikely to set anyone on fire. But surely, it would not have gone unnoticed that a new alliance was in formation. I recall this trip exceedingly well because Alan Louisi was terrified of flying. And this is one of the rare occasions he left St. Lucia on an overseas trip. And I'm trying very hard, and this is not to ridicule Alan at all, but just to share with you how paranoid he was about flying. I cannot recall Alan ever flying out of St. Lucia again after that. And you're dealing with a high court judge who used to go up and down, but flying for him was anathema. Tactically, the NGM comrades supported Odlum, but stayed clear of appearing to oppose Louisi. They urged Odlum to be patient, to wait his turn. Though preaching non-interference publicly, the Grenada comrades nonetheless communicated with Odlum on a regular basis, supporting him and the progressive elements in the Labour Party, but also warning all the time that perpetuation of political divisions at the leadership level would eventually weaken and lead to the collapse and disintegration of the government. Sounds familiar? I know. It was all in vain. Soon enough, the prediction materialized. But it was also a reality that the power struggle within the Labour Party would dent its ability as a popular national political party to effectively speak with one voice on Grenada. Odlum's refusal to bow to the needs of organizational consistency did not allow even for organization of his own large personal political base, thereby significantly reducing its ability to act as loud as it spoke. There was no doubt that Louisi was deeply distrustful of the relationship between Odlum and the Grenada leadership. Louisi was, however, particularly paranoid about the foreign policy initiatives of Odlum, who was anxious to parade his credentials before the world community. It was Odlum, for example, who, without Louise's knowledge and approval, established ties with the little-known group fighting for the liberation of the Western Sahara, the Polisario Front. This link survived until fairly recently, when it was terminated by the former UWP administration in favor of Morocco. The first major foreign policy clash occurred over the joining of the non-aligned movement. A conference of the movement was due to be held in Cuba in 1979, and the Grenadian leadership pressed St. Lucia to become a member of the grouping. Odlum proposed to the cabinet that St. Lucia attend the meeting and formally join the movement. Some members of the cabinet balked at the proposal, citing the known hostility of the movement to the United States, its relevance, value, and purpose. Odlum was accused of operating a foreign policy at the influence and dictation of Grenada. But this was far from the truth. If anyone knew Odlum well, they would know that he never yielded to the dictation of others. In the end, a compromise was agreed. St. Lucia would attend, but as an observer only. Piqued by the decision, Odlum declined to attend, and so I was selected to attend on behalf of St. Lucia. In those days, I served in the cabinet as a special advisor, as I was too young to be appointed to the Senate and serve as a fully fledged minister. It was my first trip to Cuba, and indeed, it was a truly memorable trip. But it was a decision of the comrades to accede to the request of Odlum to provide what was described as security equipment for his personal use and his faction that turned out to be the proverbial straw that finally broke the camel's back in the relationship between Alan Louisi and George Odlum. In the early weeks of the revolution, Odlum and Josie journeyed to Grenada to meet Maurice and Bernard. They persuaded them that they needed arms to protect themselves in an increasingly fractious and tumultuous political environment. I suspected then, and I still do so now, that the shipment had more to do with certifying their revolutionary ambitions and credentials. Maurice agreed, and a small shipment of equipment was made, which in time became public knowledge. And a few people in St. Lucia can still tell you where the arms were buried. I've always wondered why the police have never been interested to find out, but that's another story. Thereafter, Prime Minister Louisi considered that he had adequate or sufficient reason to question Odlum's motives for wanting to become Prime Minister. He decided that he would not cede the government to George Odlum. Louisi felt that his position was fortified by the unfolding events in Grenada, now under increasing scrutiny as the well-oiled anti-revolution propaganda took hold. There is no question that Odlum was driven by his personal ambitions and his almost reckless and insatiable appetite to govern St. Lucia. But he constantly invoked the moral high ground. Principle, he argued, justified his actions. And how often we hear lofty declarations about obedience to principle and respect to principle, and we all pay the ultimate price. As Odlum would himself reveal in an editorial comment in his Crusader newspaper, the Grenada comrades fought hard to encourage him to understand that the way he was rocking the boat will ultimately lead to the ship sinking. But in his admitted view, principle was higher than policy. He felt it right to continue rocking the boat even if it sank. Indeed, Odlum would also indicate that the Grenada comrades had struggled hard to convince him, quote, "You do not give up state power just like that," unquote. The SLP inevitably and quickly became very unpopular. Supporters were disenchanted. Chaos set in. The government was effectively crippled and then dissolved. The country would return to the polls less than 3 years later with every sign that the Labour Party would once again roam the wilderness. Even after the demise of the St. Lucia Labour Party, the NGM comrades remained loyal to Odlum and his new creation, the Progressive Labour Party. Here again, the Grenada position was interesting. The NGM continued to support him and his party as the leading public voices of support for the revolution in St. Lucia at the time. The WRM attended the official launch of the PLP and pledged that it would support the PLP for as long as the PLP supported the cause of the working class. That expression of conditional support did not go down well with Odlum, but the WRM comrades were clear about the ideological underpinnings that drove Odlum's actions. His Fabian socialist views, amassed during his political formation in the United Kingdom, naturally colored his outlook on socialism and dictated the extent to which he would go to support the NGM. Throughout those periods of political strife, the progressive elements in St. Lucia had to both support Grenada and support the PLP, even though it was clear that the divided Labour Party added up to stronger chances of a UWP victory. The events in St. Lucia, though disheartening, did not faze those who admired the initiatives underway in Grenada. So, for example, when the first and second anniversaries of the revolution were celebrated here in 1980 and 1981, there were large St. Lucian delegations on the little cargo ship that picked up visiting delegations from the other Windward Islands. But on their return home, it was to continue the battles for progress, to work for the best possible electoral outcome in the circumstances, while supporting Grenada on the one hand and intensifying the political struggle on the ground against the externally generated ideological offensive that sought to sell the SLP and PLP as supporters of deliberately concocted so-called Cuban plot to extend communism through the region using Grenada as the base. Indeed, to the eternal credit of the Grenada comrades, they maintained an open-door policy to Caribbean nationals and encouraged visits by them to Grenada to witness the transformation that was underway. Undaunted by the propaganda against the revolution, they visited in droves. Many offered their technical expertise to the cause of the revolution. In retrospect, it really was an effective way of combating the propaganda that had been unleashed against Grenada. These Caribbean citizens, alongside others from the United States of America, Canada, Europe, and neighboring Latin America, lived and worked in Grenada, served in the revolution, were part of the process, lived the dream, and shared the reality of the changes unfolding before their very eyes. In the absence of the instant information technology facilities we know today, it was those Caribbean people who became the best reporters on what was happening in Grenada, Carriacou, and Petite Martinique at the time. They returned home as Caribbean witnesses to the reality in Grenada, to Antigua and Barbuda, Barbados, Dominica, Guyana, Jamaica, St. Kitts, St. Nevis, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Trinidad and Tobago, and Suriname. And on each visit, whether for holiday or work, they shared their experiences. Likewise, those who visited from Martinique, Guadeloupe, Cayenne, French Guiana, the Dutch Antilles, and the hordes from the United States of America itself, as well as from South and Latin American states, Europe, Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Australia. The Caribbean people who lived the revolution were listened to and believed by more than just their families and friends when they spoke publicly about and showed photographs of what was really happening here, because they lived it and were part of it. In the case of St. Lucia, for example, I speak here of the likes of Bernard Lacorbinier, who served as permanent secretary in the Grenada Ministry of Finance during the Revolution, of Didacus Jules, who was a permanent secretary in your Ministry of Education and headed the National Literacy Program, of Anthony Severin, who served in the Ministry of External Affairs, and of Earl Bousquet, who served in the news departments of both Free West Indian newspaper and Radio Free Grenada. These individuals, along with the many others from several non-English speaking Caribbean countries and territories, alongside Grenadians who had returned home and citizens of countries outside the region who descended on Grenada to simply volunteer, constituted a veritable Caribbean Revolutionary Voluntary Brigade that was silent but effective, quiet but very active on the solidarity fronts at home and abroad. These also included the many St. Lucians of different walks of life who were able to travel to Grenada on assignments of different kinds that also allowed them to see and feel the Grenadian reality. To give you a reminder of how the revolution touched the lives of ordinary Caribbean citizens, I offer you the example of a popular St. Lucian fisherman better known as Zyro, Some of you may well remember that name. He was awarded a special top prize for excelling in a regional OECS fisheries training exercise conducted here by Cuban fisheries personnel through the Grenada Ministry of Fisheries. Zairo represented all of St. Lucia when he took to the podium at the National Park in St. George's to receive his award from Prime Minister Bishop during the official 1981 second anniversary celebration of the revolution. Zairo was indeed as proud as the elderly farmer from rural Grenada, who was that year also given a national award by the revolutionary government for inventing a homegrown antidote using a normally discarded part of what we simply knew as the bread nut to get rid of pests that threatened your nutmeg and cocoa harvests. There was also the institutional, I'm glad I am reminding you of these events. There were also the institutional, non-governmental and non-political relationships that were developed between Grenada and its neighbors at the organizational levels. Ties were forged between organizations representing mass organizations, such as farmers' trade unions, youth, student and women's groups. These groups interacted and exchanged ideas and programs with their Grenadian counterparts. In short, I'm trying to explain to you the sheer reach and the sheer depth of the influence of the Grenada Revolution on the people of the Caribbean. And whenever you join in anniversary or otherwise, do not underestimate your contribution to the post-independence history of the Caribbean, particularly the OECS. So for all practical purposes, Grenada in its revolutionary days was the intellectual and ideological capital of the Caribbean left and the progressive movement as a whole, howsoever defined. Grenada provided a natural opportunity for the region's progressive parties and movements to gather annually to express political support and solidarity, and of course to share experiences. Such gatherings gave an opportunity to those who argued for building parties of a new type to address the new challenges, to share their views and gauge reactions. Here it must be said, the regional left was also sharply divided over what these parties of a new type should look like. The issue was by then reduced to two choices, and you recall my earlier comments. As mentioned earlier, some argued for vanguard parties in the Leninist mode purely based on the stereotypes from Eastern European experiences 60 years earlier. Others argued for mass-based parties with broader-minded homegrown Caribbean leaders committed to a politics of a new type, adopting where appropriate a version of Jamaica's alternative path. Grenada also provided a canvas for the regional progressive movements in the region to review their strategies and tactics. In many cases, in nearly every nation in CARICOM and every island in the OECS, parties either tweaked their organizational structures or new structures emerged, spurred either by the inspiration of Grenada or the strength of the propaganda against it, or both. In effect, the regional progressive movement had a carbon copy or template by which to measure their progress, credibility, and ideological faith. I just want you to just reflect on this for a moment. Normally it's been the case throughout the Caribbean that in the Eastern Caribbean we draw political lessons from Jamaica in the north or sometimes from Trinidad in the south of Guyana. But this time, little Grenada, from that experience in 1979, became the capital to shape ideological and political thought. From the south to the north, from the east to the west. In other words, you have to have a larger view of your contribution to shaping Caribbean political thought and practice than you do. Let me add a postscript. And I have one other one after that, and then we're going to close. At one of the encounters of the progressive parties in Grenada, I shared my views on the evolving situation in St. Lucia with both Bernard and Morris. I met Bernard in the company of Bill Revere of Dominica, it was 3 of us, and suggested that the left in St. Lucia could not conceivably adopt the Grenadian path as the environment had changed dramatically. I argued for a reformed mass party, social democratic in ideological orientation, but led by progressive leadership. It was a difficult conversation. Bernard was not convinced. Later that evening, I met Morris at a cocktail and shared with him my conversation with Bernard. Though tired and exhausted, he listened politely and respectfully, but did not offer a view. That was the last time I saw both Bernard and Morris. In retrospect, some hard and difficult lessons have emerged. It seems to me that there are moments in political life when self-fulfilling prophecies gather momentum of their own. Politicians engage in inflicting wounds that are unavoidable and inescapable. Unquestionably, the irreconcilable differences within the St. Lucia Labour Party prevented the party from offering a greater level of support, cooperation and solidarity with Grenada. The eventual fall of the Labour government and the electoral loss of both Labour parties led to the UWA winning the premature 1982 general elections by a massive majority of 14-3. That dealt a near fatal blow to not only the progressive forces in the Lucia region, but most of all to the aspirations of the overwhelming majority of St. Lucians who had reposed their trust in the Labour Party on July 2, 1979. The fall of the SLP government from a self-inflicted blow as near fatal as could be the doses of political cyanide that killed the Grenada Revolution shortly after. In both cases, intransigence prevailed when compromise was absolutely essential. Clearly, subjective factors were allowed to overwhelm the objective political conditions. It was ironic that the Grenada comrades urged peace, compromise, and reconciliation in St. Lucia, yet compromise eluded them in their situation. The hard lesson here was that in both cases, in Grenada and St. Lucia, the leadership of the respective parties pursued rather narrow, self-serving agendas which ultimately consumed and destroyed the promise of political and economic reform. Once the purity of an ideological position is adopted, then it has a compelling, inexorable logic of its own. And you can read as much as you want into that. With the demise of the Grenada Revolution, the Caribbean left disintegrated and splintered into different directions. Where are we now? The radicals of the left 40 years ago. It's a question that few want to raise, and no answers seem to be forthcoming. I'm going to raise it tonight. And if you think I'm raising it in the inexorable logic of its own, you're wrong. I'm not raising it for that reason. It is now for history to deliver its verdict on our generation, our decisions, choices, and actions. We were all witnesses to the birth and the demise of the Grenada Revolution. What is often not realized is that the events in Grenada were as deeply troubling, hurtful, and traumatic experience for us as it was for the people of Grenada. How we felt about the Grenadian events have never been understood, explored, or measured. True, there have been personal statements, but I doubt the full story has been told. Perhaps with hindsight, it was difficult to find the right words. It is still the case today. In nearly every Caribbean territory, the radical left renounced its left-wing credentials and aspirations and joined the mainstream political parties, albeit in different directions. Many also quickly embraced the trappings of Westminster democracy. Tim Hector, bless his soul, the leader of the ACLM of Antigua in his closing days, drew closer to his former nemesis, Lester Bird, and provided him with constructive support. Harold Lovell, a disciple of Hector, my close and beloved friend, gravitated to the UPP of Baldwin Spencer in opposition, later becoming a minister and leader of the UPP after Baldwin's retirement. Ralph Gonzalez. A former radical member of the Yulu Liberation Movement, Ulimo joined the St. Vincent and the Grenadines Labour Party and symbolized his entry by successfully renaming and rebranding ex-Premier Milton Cato's party as a Unity Labour Party, ULP. He has won 3 successive elections, albeit by slim majorities, and is now the longest-serving CARICOM Prime Minister. Trevor Monroe's Workers' Party of Jamaica, the WPJ, ceased to exist. Trevor drew closer to the PNP, eventually becoming an independent senator in the Jamaican Parliament. Trevor now manages an NGO focusing on fighting corruption and entrenching new standards of accountability in public life. Much of the same thing happened in Dominica. Some joined the Dominica Labour Party in the footsteps of Rosie Douglas, while others made their way to the opposition United Workers' Party. In the case of St. Lucia, Peter Josie abandoned the St. Lucia Labour Party and joined the United Workers' Party, where he remains to this day. George Odlum became the UWP's ambassador at the United Nations in New York. He resigned to contest the Castries Central constituency against Vaughan Lewis, who had been selected to replace John Compton as the leader of the UWP. Odlum was unsuccessful. In actual fact, he has never won an election in St. Lucia, save and except when he contested as a member of the St. Lucia Labour Party. In my case, I resumed my ties with the St. Lucia Labour Party in 1996, became its leader, and led it to electoral victory on 3 occasions and to defeat twice. But there is another interesting postscript. During my tenure and prior to the general elections of 1997, George Odlum was readmitted to the St. Lucia Labour Party. Following our victory in 1997, he was appointed foreign minister once again. Unfortunately, however, the tiger had not changed its spots. Differences arose, and I opted to terminate him, although he denies it and says that he had time to resign before I effectively terminated him. Either way, the result was the same, for which I was pleased. May the Lord bless his soul. He briefly formed an alliance with the United Workers' Party in a bid to oust the SLP, but the effort was stillborn and died. He contested the general elections of 2001, but failed. Indeed, he was defeated by someone not yet born when he first contested the seat. These are just a few of the principal actors of the period. I admit, I am constantly preoccupied with how history will judge us. All of us, we the offspring of the radical left of the 1970s. Will history treat us as opportunists who denounced our faith, or as converts to pragmatism? Or are we the new neoliberals? Perhaps we may be spared a harsh judgment and be credited for reading correctly the future of the left. The phenomenon which I have just described, perhaps in confession, was not uniquely Caribbean. Just consider for a moment that Daniel Ortega of the Sandinistas fame adopted mainstream politics in Nicaragua and was elected to govern more than once. Look at the experience of the ANC in South Africa under Venerable Nelson Mandela. Is there a deeper, greater lesson? Whatever the verdict of history may be, the memory of Grenada was always part of our psyche, our politics, and its practice. Before I close very briefly, I want to touch on one or two little aspects. There are several other aspects of the Grenada Revolution's influence beyond its shores that impacted on our own approaches to governance. And I say this as I look across what we did in St. Lucia, what Gonzalez has done in St. Vincent, what Skerritt has done in Dominica, what has happened in, let us say, for example, Antigua. We had heard the accounts of zonal and parish council meetings that brought communities together to discuss important matters of state and projects that would affect them. I particularly remember the community meetings to discuss and craft Grenada's annual budgets. We heard of the weekly voluntary work brigades engaging in house repairs fixing homes for those who could not afford with materials donated by the state and friendly private sector persons. And just as an aside very quickly, and I know my colleague is there, we actually fashioned a home repair program based largely on the experience in Grenada. But we focused mainly on improving the quality of housing for the elderly. So I can tell you that was a policy where it actually emerged. We saw the efforts of the Grenada Revolutionary Government to attack and reduce poverty throughout the length and breadth of Grenada. And of course, our prototype for this in St. Lucia was the creation of something called the Poverty Reduction Fund, again springing from the political practice of Grenada. We heard of the free health care being offered by the Cuban doctors and the improvements of fishing yield from techniques introduced by the Cubans. All of these initiatives were novel departures from the traditional model of governance inherited from Westminster. Years later, some of us would remember these initiatives and embrace them in our own approaches to governance. Unfortunately, though, we never acknowledged, that our inspiration came from Grenada in its revolutionary days. I was pleased, therefore, after the last general elections here produced a government without opposition for a third time, to hear a prominent Grenadian lecturer at the UWI, I believe, proposed that the new administration adopt some of the positive achievements of the revolution. I think that should be extended beyond Grenada's shores. In my political life as a decision maker at the national and regional levels from 1979 to 1981 and again from 1997 until now, I continue to try to learn from the unending lessons from the Grenada Revolution, good and bad, palatable and unpalatable. The truths from Grenada over the past 40 years are both comfortable and uncomfortable. It will be for the people of Grenada, Carriacou and Petite Martinique to make the real decisions on the future applicability of the revolution's lessons at home. It will be for you to decide which of the so many varying accounts being offered to you about what each of you went through, especially between October 17, 1983, when Morris Bishop was detained, and October 25, 1983, when about 7,000 U.S. troops descended on this island of less than 100,000, in either an invasion or what some apologists have described as a rescue mission. It is also for you to decide if 40 years later truth and reconciliation have been achieved or should still be pursued. What I do know is that the time has come to elevate Morris Bishop to the pantheon of revered revolutionaries. At my distance, I continue to admire the efforts to search for forgiveness, to urge reconciliation, to preach tolerance, and to find peace. Peace be unto you and with you. Long live the memory of our Grenada Revolution. May the legacy of Morris Bishop forever remain in the hearts and breasts of men and women of Grenada, our region, and our hemisphere. I thank you for being such a wonderful audience.